And we're live. Awesome. Hey, everybody. How's it going? I'm John, and this is Ty. And today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Chrome developer tools. Now, a lot has changed in the past, especially if you've been going through our courses and have been looking at, the tools themselves and, looking at these timelines and seeing like, oh my gosh, this looks so different. How the heck do I begin using these? Well, we're hopefully going to clear up a lot of those questions you have and maybe clear up, questions you may not have, as we're going to try and go through all the tabs in the developer tools. And so, Ty, you want to introduce yourself and then kind of get us started here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. So, hey, everybody. I'm Ty. I'm a CM here at Udacity, or course manager, rather. And I'm also a front-end and back-end web developer. And like John said, today we're going to be talking about the dev tools. So let's get started. For reference, we're going to be using Chrome 48, which is the latest stable release of Chrome, and that's kind of important since things change really fast. So if you haven't updated your Chrome and you're confused why what we're doing looks so different, that could be the reason. But anyway, I'm going to share my screen with all of you and take you to the world's worst website ever.
It's pretty bad. I was not sure what to expect when you said this, and it's definitely definitely the worst website I've seen in a long while. It really reminds me of sort of like geosites.
Yes, we've got all of the worst parts of HTML and CSS present here. Once you guys make it through the front-end degree, you will never have to worry about making something that looks this terrible. But anyway, I figured it would be funny to use this one as an example. So I'm going to open up the developer tools, and if you're on Windows, I believe it's Control Shift C to open them. Oh, no, sorry, Control Shift I to open them, and on Mac it's Command Opt I. So hopefully you can see the dev tools all right. John, does that look okay?
Yeah, it looks pretty good on my end. You can also zoom in if you guys do have trouble seeing the dev tools. You can zoom in to it like you would any other page. I believe Command plus makes the font a little bigger.
So I'm using plus and minus right here to make it a little bigger and smaller.
So sometimes that comes in handy because I know when I have like my big monitor up and running, sometimes it is a little hard to see some of the text in those tabs. So even if you're not screencasting like we are, it's still handy to be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So let's jump right into it. So we're basically going to walk you guys through each of the tabs in the dev tools that you can see them right at the top. And we're going to go basically left to right almost. But we're going to start at the left with the Elements tab. And the Elements tab, as the name suggests, lets you inspect all of the HTML elements on the page. Kind of the most useful way to use it is to take a look at your web page. I'll make this a little smaller. And let's say I wasn't too happy with how this looked. I decided, you know what, I don't want to call this the world's worst website ever. In fact, we're going to call it the world's best website ever, which it's not, but we'll pretend it is. So what I did right there was this little button right here, or optionally Command-Shift-C on Mac and Control-Shift-C on Windows, lets me open up the element inspector. And you can see me kind of moving around the page with my cursor, and elements are highlighting everywhere. Those of you that have taken some of the front-end dyno degree might be already familiar with this. But basically, I can go around, and then when I find the element I want to look at, I can click it, and it will actually highlight right in the dev tools, which is pretty convenient. And then once I'm there, there's a bunch of things I can do. So I can change the actual content by double-clicking right there. So we're going to go best, and then there you go. I can actually double-click some of the attributes, too, and change them. So I could make this, let's say, 60 point. Then it gets really big.
Just making it look worse and worse.
Yeah, exactly. If we want to make it look better, we can make it smaller. You can do this with all the attributes. And when you right-click on the DOM node itself, it actually gives you a lot more options too. So we can edit the entire node as HTML, which opens up this little kind of basic text editor. That could be helpful if you wanted to add in, let's say, other nodes, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to do that right now, but you get the idea. could be useful if you have like a list, an unordered list, and you wanted to like add another element in for some reason. If we go over and find a link on the website, let's say right here, we can do something pretty useful. So if I right-click on that link element, I can actually force the element to have a particular state. So like, let's say you had a link that was supposed to change color. When you hovered over it, and you wanted to see what that looked like, so you could actually force the hover state on the element. And while this website being kind of terrible doesn't do anything fancy with the CSS like that, yeah, you could see how that would be very useful. What we can also do from here is go to the right, I'll make this a little bigger, and inspect all of the CSS styles that have been applied to the elements on the page. So if I click like a random paragraph right here, I can see that the text align is supposed to be in the center. It's in a table, which is kind of an old school HTML element if you're not familiar with it. It's still used today, but definitely more of a 90s leftover at this point. And we can kind of see that a bunch of styles have been applied to like the fonts, some table specific stuff, and like I said, like the text in the center, things like that. And what's cool is you can actually enable and disable those styles with this checkbox just by hovering over them. Anything that's gray, you can't change yourself. Anything that's white, you can edit. And if you wanted to actually add new styles too, you can click right here on element.style, and that'll let you just input custom styles. And Chrome is kind of smart, so it'll actually autocomplete for you. Whoops, till I mess up. Good background color, and then it could say blue. And then you can see it changed up here. So that's pretty much all you need to know for the element tab as far as like the basics. It's pretty cool. I use it all the time in web development, very helpful. Oops.
I know one of the things that that's planned to be added to like the elements panel as well is like a color picker. I think there's even like plugins that you can use for that, and I think even in Chrome Canary it's available now. So that'll come in handy when you're trying to just like play around with those styles and you're just trying to fine tune a color. I really do like that panel.
Okay, yeah, that sounds super helpful. I didn't hear about that, but I do know that in Chrome 49, which is the next version, there are a bunch of huge improvements coming to the like developer side of things, including even like CSS variables, from what I heard. Kind of unrelated, but pretty cool.
Yeah, I've heard of that too. And I mean, a lot of this stuff was shown off at the previous Chrome Developers Conference. So you can feel free to go back and watch those videos to see some of the stuff that's coming out in the future. So I'm going to share my worst website here, and I'm going to share one of my favorite tabs, which is the console tab. And actually, the console tab is super handy because it's going to show you a lot of things about your website. It's a great place to see where JavaScript's breaking and where just any sort of problems may be occurring in like the network and stuff like that. It's basically a fully interactive JavaScript interpreter for you to sort of use on your website. So basically anything that gets logged, so basically anywhere in your code you do console.log is going to show up here. So that's pretty handy, especially when you're trying to like debug some things. You maybe just want to throw in like some log reports in there to see like, okay, what's happening? Let me log out this variable and see what's going on. You can also do all kinds of other useful debugging things like console.warn, console.error, console.group, group end, a certain table. You can also use console.time to kind of time specific functions. But pretty much anything you would write in your JavaScript file, you can do here. So, I mean, we can look at things like the window variable. We can manipulate things in the window variable. Anything that's accessible globally on the client side is going to be accessible inside this console. So it's important to note, that's kind of an important thing to note is, any code that isn't wrapped in an immediately invoked function expression or like in a document.ready for jQuery users, is going to be accessible from this console. So we can see that, I have access to the window object. I have access to the document object. Those are pretty common global objects. And using the console, I can actually go in and manipulate these, as well as being able to see some errors that could be occurring in my code. Now, there's sort of two things a lot of people have questions about with the console. It's like, okay, my console's full of crap. How do I get rid of it? You can simply just run the clear command, and it'll clean out your log. And then sort of the second question that people often ask is, okay, well, I want to actually kind of see things stay in the log. So you can see when I refresh the page here, everything in my log kind of like goes away, and then it sort of reloads everything. If I want to keep my log to stay active between refreshes and stuff, I can check this preserve log, refresh. It'll tell me where I navigated to, and then it'll relog this information. And there's all kinds of like little filters you can apply so for searching for different things. So if you only want to see the errors or only the warnings, only sort of the debug or things that have been handled, you can hide just network messages, or you can sort of filter through the messages if you're getting a lot of console errors, which is super handy to kind of dig through when things like this show up. You get a bunch of 404s and you're trying to figure out specific 404 errors that you have. I think that's about it as far as the console is concerned. Did I miss anything here?
One thing you might want to mention is that little drop. Yeah, you've hovered over it. That little drop down. It's pretty useful if you have like some nested iframes in your code, because it lets you switch context, so that because what's accessible globally in like the main frame is not the same as what's accessible globally in the iframe. So that can also be helpful for debugging.
Good point. Good point. Yeah. So this, as Ty mentioned, this drop down here will let you pick and choose sort of what iframe you're looking at or what frame you're looking at. You can see I can access all of my Chrome plugins here, like my LastPass, Live Reload, my reactive tools. So you can even go in and kind of like access those and play around with their consoles. Sweet. All right, so let's see, Ty, what's next? I think we got the network tab next.
Yes, another.
One thing I want to note too is if there's a specific order you like things in, so I like having the console open first, you should actually be able to click and drag the tabs around now, so you can order them however you like, which is super handy.
Yeah, you can, and I think it'll persist, right, when you like close Chrome and reopen it.
Yeah, it's connected to the Chrome user profile, so it'll persist between sessions.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, next up is the network tab, which is another very commonly used one. So I will share my screen with you guys once again. So if we go to the network tab right here, right now there's nothing. But what you'll notice right up here in the top left is that this little recording button is active. And what that means is that it's listening for kind of outgoing requests. So if I refresh the page right here with the network tab open, you're going to see a bunch of stuff pop in. So I can just scroll up. We don't need to look at the page for this. And this is kind of straightforward. It basically tells you all of the HTTP requests that your website's made. And as well as like useful information like what type of file was requested, where the request was initiated, like was it from an HTML file, JavaScript, Chrome itself, the size of the request, how long it took, which is very useful for kind of debugging performance. And most importantly, the status, did you get it? Was it a 404? Like we can see right here, highlighted in red, this updated.gif file did not show up. We got a 404, which means page not found. And you can actually click these little things at the top, the little tabs, to sort, which is very helpful, especially if you have like a ton of requests. Sometimes websites will make, dozens, if not hundreds of requests. So it can be helpful to be able to sort, as well as use this filter search bar to find specific files that you're looking for. So what's more useful than this is that you can actually click on one of the resources that was requested, and you'll get information about the HTTP request. So you can see what the method was. Right here is a get, the status code we got, the full URL that we were requesting. So if I were to open up that in a different tab, you can see that this is the JavaScript file that was requested. It just happens to be from the same domain name. And then you can get a lot more advanced information, like cookies that were sent back and forth, session information, all of the HTTP headers. So really, really useful stuff if you're doing front-end development. And Chrome will actually format the response for you, or it'll try to at least. It doesn't always work.
It generally works pretty decent.
Yeah, for any kind of standard file type, it'll like an image, it should show you the response. So like right there, you can see the GIF. So Chrome is really good about this kind of stuff. It formats everything for you nicely. Then you can actually get timing information too, more details on the request timeline. I'm not sure if there's too much else to the network tab. It's pretty straightforward, but very, very, very useful. You can also, other than the search bar right here, you can actually filter by the type of request as well, or the file type of the request. So there's all the images, JavaScripts, style sheets, things like that.
It might be worthwhile to just mention what XHR is.
XHR is, those are AJAX requests, correct? So transferring like JSON data generally.
Yeah, so usually anything that more often than not you're calling in through HTTP. So other websites, resources, as Ty mentioned, JSON files, things like that.
Yeah, generally what you'll see there is JSON files. I'm actually not sure if I don't think it's only JSON files. It can be XML and things like that too. It's generally any kind of like cross-site request.
Cool. All right, so let's see, what tab do we have next? I think it's the exciting timeline, which I'm going to talk about. So let me pop back open my screen share of the best website I've ever seen. And let's talk about the timeline tab. So the timeline tab is where you can kind of take a snapshot of everything going on your page at different times, from recording what happens when a user clicks a button to recording what happens when a user first comes to the page. A few things to kind of talk about is these check marks here. These determine like what you capture. Typically, at the bare minimum, you kind of want to capture just a JavaScript profile. But more recently, you can get sort of screenshots and sort of painting of the page. So that basically gives you sort of screenshots in time of what the page looks like per every 100 milliseconds. So let's take a look. Let's actually record a timeline of me sort of reloading this page. It's really slow. All right, let's finish that recording. And it takes a second. Usually it's processing a lot of stuff that happened. So we're going to just kind of wait a second here while it finishes gathering all this information. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. Hopefully I didn't just break it. Sometimes the timeline can be a little mad, especially with like really bad websites. Oh no, what happened here?
Uh-oh. Did the whole console freeze up?
I think it might have. All right, let's try this again. Let's see. All right, ready? Let's capture new timeline, refresh the page, finish. Oh man, I'm gonna be so mad if the timeline doesn't work for me today. If it doesn't, we can always go try another website.
Yeah, hopefully it's not the website. It's working earlier. Sometimes Hangouts can slow down Chrome quite a bit, so I'm wondering if that is related.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also have pictures of some timelines that I can pull up, but that's not as fun as doing it live. All right, let me try doing just a timeline of Google. Oh, hey, haha, okay. I just needed to be patient. I'm not patient enough for this thing. All right. So I'm actually going to zoom in a bit here so we can kind of see some of this stuff. All right. So actually, I'm actually going to even pop out my, let me pop out my dev tools here and share just that. So we don't really need to look at this terrible website to see what's going on here. All right, so here we have our timeline. So we can actually see along the top here all of this sort of time frame that these events are happening in milliseconds. And we kind of have these sort of green, red bars up here. This is sort of the paint, the layout, some load events. You can kind of hover over most things and it'll tell you what they are. This next sort of red stripe here, this indicates to us sort of where Google Chrome suspects there may be performance or responsiveness issues. So basically anywhere on the page where it might not look so well on a desktop or a tablet, just anywhere where loading something might cause some chug for the end user. The next thing we have here is the FPS meter. And this is actually sort of mostly what the old timeline was. You used to sort of have this combination of this timeline with the one below it, where these were the colored bars and you kind of saw like how much FPS they took up. But this one's strictly frames per second. Ideally, you want these bars to be as high as possible. So anywhere where these bars are almost touching sort of the red stripe above it is where we're performing at about 60 FPS. Anywhere where it's really low is pretty bad, and those are kind of like sections where we might want to investigate what's causing the FPS to just take such a huge drop. The next chart we have here is basically our CPU usage. This is kind of giving us a real-time look at all the events that are happening on the page and sort of all the computations our computer and browser is doing. Typically, I believe, if I remember correctly here, yellow is JavaScript, blue is paints, purple is network events, green is, oh gosh, layout events, and gray is everything else, is just any sort of other event that could be happening on the page. When they kind of are reaching the top here, that means the CPU is working at 100% capacity, trying to process that code. Ideally, you would like to see, not quite this giant mountain that we have going on here. Hopefully you have more sections that are a little bit lower, so you're not using as much CPU usage. This next section where we see sort of these blue stripes and yellow stripes and green stripes are more of an indicator of these events occurring, so any sort of like network events that are happening. So this is probably requesting the content to do this paint, and then it's actually performing this paint. So again, if I remember correctly, I believe blue.
Oh yeah, blue is network requests.
Blue is network requests.
That it's at the beginning.
There we go. Okay, cool. So blue is network events. Yellow is JavaScript events. Green is paint and layout events, and then purple is.
Purple, I believe, is when styles are recalculated, actually. So if you edit CSS in the code itself.
There we go. Purple is styles, so any of your CSS. And then gray is everything else, so images loading, stuff like that. And we can see that it took screenshots along the way here, so we can kind of go in and inspect these little screenshots, which is pretty handy to be able to kind of go in and browse these and kind of see what has loaded on the page and what the page looks like at specific points in time. And then I'm going to zoom out a bit to see this next section. We have our actual flame view of all this, which we can, I believe, toggle is two different modes. There's sort of this view, which kind of shows you, should be pretty familiar for those of you who've been using the dev tools. But we can basically see like the events and sort of the order they execute. And you can open up some of them here that have sort of a tree of things happening. And you can kind of explore the JavaScript files that are executing here. And then when we switch it to this view, we can actually get an even more in-depth look at this. We can kind of zoom in and out on certain events happening. And when you click on these events, you get like a nice little summary of what's going on. It tells you, what script is running, how long it took to run, what type of event it was. It also can show you the call tree. So if there's more events that it calls, you can sort of see those. So we can see that there's sort of a loading event that happens, parsing the HTML, evaluating a script, and then a few other events going on below it. And then you can also do it from sort of a bottom-up perspective, where you're basically just kind of going through that tree the opposite direction. So that is pretty handy, especially when you want to evaluate sort of the performance of your site and figuring out where things are breaking, where performance is just taking a huge hit. And as I mentioned, the great thing too is you can kind of like go from here, click on this, and it'll take you to the sources tab and directly to that chunk of code. That actually segues pretty nicely into the next bit, which is the sources tab, I believe, right?
Yeah, so I will share my screen with you guys once more, and we can take a look at the sources tab. And the sources tab is essentially where you can read, edit, and debug your JavaScript files. So this one right here only has one file, and that is animate.js. So I can actually view the JavaScript file itself in a kind of like basic IDE or a text editor view. So I can actually go in and add my own code right there. That is not valid code for sure. And if actually, this is pretty useful too. If let's say your site had minified code, and what minified means, if you haven't heard that term before, is basically the file gets compressed down to like usually one line, and all of the variable names become obfuscated, so usually just one or two letters. It's basically to make the file as small as possible so it can be requested over the network as quickly as possible. So if you had minified or poorly formatted code that you wanted to expect, this button right here on the bottom left of the text editor, it's two curly brackets. It's called the pretty printer, and it basically will take your code and format it in a nicer kind of standardized way so you can actually go through and view it. Another important aspect to the sources tab is using the debugger. And there are a bunch of different ways to use Chrome's debugger. So the first of all is actually through your code itself. If you were working on a website and you wanted to test your JavaScript and set breakpoints in the code, let's pretend I wasn't in Chrome right now. I'm just in my text editor. You could use the debugger keyword with a semicolon at the end of it, and that essentially tells Chrome to put a breakpoint right there, and it'll stop execution. And actually, when Chrome gets to that debugger line, it'll actually go ahead and open up the sources tab and go to that file automatically for you, which is really handy. So that's how you would do it through your code itself. With the sources tab, there are some other ways to use the debugger. You can set breakpoints by clicking on the line number to the left. Oop, why is that not working? Oh, maybe because I've edited the file. Let me try this again. Yeah, there we go. OK, cool. So I can set breakpoints at arbitrary locations, any line. And you'll see on the right little tab right here, it'll tell me where the breakpoints I put are, and I can enable and disable them from here. Or I can just completely get rid of them by clicking on the line number again. So that's like basic breakpoints just through the JavaScript. Another really useful type of breakpoint, or two actually, is DOM breakpoints, which I can't create from here. But if I were to go back to the Elements tab, what I could do is pick a DOM element I cared about, let's say this paragraph tag, and I could set a breakpoint So on kind of different events. So if the DOM style, or if the DOM node style was modified by CSS or JavaScript, I could set a breakpoint to like kind of alert me when that happens and stop execution. If the node gets deleted through the code, like jQuery, I think it's like .remove or something like that, or delete. I'm not sure. Haven't used it in a while. You could set a breakpoint there through the Elements tab. But if we go back to the Sources tab, you can also set breakpoints on events. So click events on different DOM nodes, things like that. HTML being parsed, scripts loading, keyboard, mouse up and mouse down. So lots of different ways to set breakpoints, all very useful. I think that is it for the Sources tab. What I find myself using the most is definitely the little code pretty printer, and then just kind of stepping through and understanding the code. But breakpoints are definitely super useful too. John, is there anything you think I missed?
No, not that I can think of. Maybe. Nah, I think that about covers it in the Sources tab. I mean, it's really handy for just kind of exploring the files on the site, and just kind of setting those breakpoints. Other than that, I mean, one of the things that a lot of people ask is like, okay, well, can I edit my JavaScript from the Sources tab and be able to, kind of basically live edit my code? And currently there isn't a way to do that in Chrome DevTools, but it is something that I've heard a lot of talk about adding in the future. So hopefully that'll be something that gets added, so you can kind of like mess with your JavaScript files and your source files.
Luckily it's easy enough with what front-end web dev to just edit the files yourself and refresh the page. But yeah, I think that will be coming to Chrome soon. Like the ability to edit the file in the Sources tab and refresh the page and have your edits persist.
Mm-hmm. All right, last one here that I'm going to screen share is the Resources tab. So the Resources tab shows you basically all the resources that the page has kind of like cached or is storing, and really just sort of anything that this page has. So we can look at all the images. We can look at all the scripts that I've loaded. So a lot of this stuff is similar to what we find in the Sources tab. But additionally, like I mentioned, we actually are able to see information about what's in the cache, if there's anything that's been cached by WebSQL or IndexedDB. We can also look at anything that's been stored in local storage. So we can see that this person has, make this a little bigger and this a little longer. We can see that they're using Google Ads on their website, and they're kind of, have a few pieces of information cached in local storage for whatever reason.
Yeah, usually for advertising and tracking and things like that.
So yeah, and then we can look at sort of the session storage, which is, so local storage usually persists, whereas session storage is just the cache for this unique session. Whereas local storage persists for a user account typically for a couple hours or a day or two. I think
you can even close the browser and reopen it, and it'll still be there.
Cookies, yum, same sort of thing. We can look at all of the sort of information that's sort of cached by these cookies. There's also sort of the application cache that you can set up, and any sort of cache storage you want to set up. And for those who are interested in service workers, this is actually where you can look at any sort of worker objects operating on the site. A good, let's see, I think Google actually should have a service worker on it. Let's take a look. Maybe not, we'll find out in a second, I guess. Yeah, so we can see all the information about our service worker here. For those of you who, this isn't something we cover in the front-end web developer nano degree. It's a little bit of a more advanced feature that's really new to the web. But we do cover it in the senior web developer nano degree. So if you're interested in sort of what service workers are, what they're used for, how you can use them, what the heck this panel is in the resources tab, be sure to check out that nanodegree and specifically the offline first course, where you can learn a little bit about what this service worker is and why you would want to use one.
Yeah, at the most basic level, if you just kind of want a definition, it's basically a script that kind of runs in the background, and it's not necessarily attached to the page that you're on. Just you kind of view it as like a background process on a computer almost, but just for the browser.
Yeah, and then I have a few extra tabs here, like the security tab, which is pretty new. It's more just something implemented by Google to make sure that the page is secure based on what they consider as secure pages. Does it use HTTPS? Does it have a valid certificate? Is it using a secure TLS connection? Is it using secure resources? This is handy if you're kind of in that sort of full stacky part of the world where you're also kind of dealing with this kind of stuff. But as a front-end developer, you probably don't have to worry about this page so much. But it's still handy from time to time, especially if you're doing some more of the server setup kind of stuff on your page as well. And then the last couple tabs I have here is an audit tab. This one's actually eventually going to get officially supported by Chrome. But this will let you sort of audit your pages for accessibility, network utilization, and performance. So if you run it, it basically just kind of does some tests on your page and then gives you a bunch of information on whether or not your page is accessible. So, are you using good colors so that colorblind people are able to understand the page well? Are you, utilizing the network by leveraging browser caching, setting minimum cookie sizes? Are you doing the right things for performance? So a lot of this stuff would be sort of what you used to do with PageSpeed Insights, and it's going to be completely integrated into the Chrome developer tools pretty soon. But in the meantime, you can find it on the Chrome store as a plugin that you can install, and it'll automatically set up in the widgets. These last two, I'm not going to dive too deep into, but they're just debuggers for specific frameworks. So if there is a framework you're using, say Backbone, Ember, or Knockout, more often than not, you can usually find some kind of debugging tool that you just download, it installs, it sets up its own Chrome tab, and it'll make it handy for sort of debugging applications that are using that technology, because sometimes it does become difficult to debug those using just the elements or sources or console tabs.
Yeah, these JavaScript frameworks are very complicated.
Yeah.
And I think you can find those just as like Chrome extensions on the store, right? The Chrome Web Store.
Yeah. So most of those are on the Chrome Web Store. Even some of the frameworks sites have them listed there. But yeah, I mean, it's just as easy as finding, Googling Backbone or Ember or Angular, Chrome developer tools, and usually the first link that pops up in Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, whatever you decide to use, will be that Chrome Web Store link. Yeah, so that's pretty much the Chrome Dev Tools. If you do have any more questions about it, or if you're finding it difficult to parse something or understand something in the Dev Tools, or if things change dramatically again, which they always seem to do because the Google team is constantly iterating on these, we'll be happy to clarify any points you guys have in the forum. But let's take a look and see if we got any questions. We had one a little earlier from Jonas about what regex is, and I went ahead and answered it in the chat, but I'll say it out loud here as well. Regex is just short for regular expressions, and it's just a pattern matching language that you can use to sort of match patterns of strings. It's really handy for sort of parsing over data and parsing over files and just picking out specific pieces of content that you want. It's a pretty handy language. It's pretty common in most programming languages to use some sort of regex functionality. And there's a lot of sort of regex interpreters online that you can use to kind of like practice and play around with your regular expressions. We get this one from Alex that says, it would be nice, in fact, if you show an actual debugging process how to step around functions, etc.
You know what? In the forum post, I can go into a lot more detail with the debugger. In hindsight, the website we picked probably doesn't have enough complicated JavaScript to do anything worthwhile with the debugger. But look out for that forum post, which will be coming out in under an hour, most likely, and I will go super in depth into the debugger.
Yeah, and I mean the debugger is a pretty handy tool. I would say I use it. I use it when I'm doing like a really like most of my websites aren't super JavaScript heavy, but I think it comes in handy a lot for projects like the classic arcade game project, where there's sort of a lot of continuous JavaScript functions sort of continually running and looping and executing while the user's on the page. Um,
Yeah, and like single page JavaScript apps using like those big frameworks we mentioned, Angular, Backbone, or Ember, that's when the debugger comes in handy. For
mhm.
most kind of like static websites that are mostly HTML and CSS based, you don't really need it, but for those bigger JavaScripty websites, definitely useful. So yeah, again, I'll go into a lot of detail in that in the forum post and with screenshots and everything like that.
Cool. It doesn't look like we have any other questions unless they start coming in. But yeah, I mean, the dev tools are, you're going to be buried in them. It's a really good skill to have as a web developer. It's going to give you a lot of insights into your website and websites other people build. In fact, it's honestly it's easy to learn by just going to other websites that you're familiar with, cracking open the dev tools and just kind of playing around with them. The more experience you get just kind of trying things out, the easier it is to remember them, and the easier it is for you to remember, like, oh, hey, I can do this in dev tools. Or it's even great for looking at websites and trying to mimic things as well. That's a big part of the learning process as well, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's great for if you get inspired by something on a website you stumble upon and you want to kind of learn how to do it. The dev tools make it, just a click away.
Yeah, I love doing that. I think there's a lot of websites that I go to or a lot of blogs that I see where some developers done some really nice like CSS animation or has like a really cool flyout or some really cool text, and I'm like, oh man, what font is that? And it's really easy to just like highlight it, crack open the dev tools, and see right away like, oh, okay, they're using this font. This is how they're sort of triggering this animation, or this is the JavaScript they're using. Um, it you know it kind of feels like you're playing detective sometimes, and I think I like that.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So any last thoughts from you, Ty?
No, like John said, the best way to learn the dev tools is definitely just jump in and start playing around. In the forum post that I mentioned that I'll be posting shortly soon, or shortly after the call, is that Google has great documentation. So I'll be sharing a link to the DevTools documentation. That's really the only place you need to go to learn about the DevTools. They did a really good job with that.
Yeah, and going through their documentation, there's still some things too that need to be updated, especially on the timeline tab.
Yeah, the timeline I noticed in the docs, it was slightly outdated. It looked like it was from the last version of Chrome. But as far as the screenshots need to be updated, but most of the information there is very up to date, and the
Mhm.
tutorials are really helpful. They kind of show you how to do all of kind of the basic things we mentioned, and there's a lot more advanced stuff you can do with the dev tools as well if you want to dive in.
Yeah, and like we mentioned, if you guys are having trouble or you forget about this webcast in the future and you're like, oh, I can't figure out how to do this in the dev tools, always feel free to ask in the forum. You can ping us directly using at John Mav, and for Ty, I think it's just at Ty.
Yeah, it's either at Ty or at Ty Lucas Kelly. I think it's just at Ty on the forums.
Cool. Or in Slack, that works as well if you
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
ping me from there. All right. Let's see. We got one last quick question in from Jay, who says, "Are the dev tools any different with Chrome Canary?" And the answer is yeah. Typically, you're going to find a lot of sort of beta features and early features that are introduced into the dev tools. Most of the general stuff is still pretty much the same. Like they haven't completely changed the console tab or they haven't completely changed the network tab. But what you might find is you might find that there's an extra button there, or it might give you a little bit of different information, or maybe there's a new tab on there that includes some new features that you're able to use. But generally, all the sort of previous tabs and features that are accessible and sort of earlier versions of Chrome are available in Chrome Canary. They haven't done any sort of like real gigantic overhaul where it's vastly changed the way the dev tools work.
Yeah, you should still totally feel at home in the Canary dev tools.
And one last question from Meal MH. Where do we find the links to the page that you were talking about? We'll be posting them in the forums. And we'll make sure to send out the link via Slack. I'll update this video's description with the link to that as well. And I'll see about getting maybe the link emailed out for those of you wanting to go back and look at that. But they'll be in the course forums in the broadcasts and announcements section. Sweet. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Ty.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Everyone have a good rest of your Monday, and we'll see you next time.